If you looked at my music collection, two bands would stick out. Those bands are New Order and KMFDM. And it's not that I'm a mega fan, well, I guess I was a mega fan at one time, or at least I was a mega fan for a certain period in each band's history, but mostly they've just had way more releases than most bands I listen to. So on my shelf, KMFDM takes up about a foot of space and New Order takes up slightly less than that. I'd say I have about 27 KMFDM physical CDs, probably more of those on digital. Started buying them digitally after I decided not to have so much stuff around the house. I have to say I'm not a fan in general of digital quote-unquote ownership, especially with Apple. Apple has digital rights management that constantly pesters me about the music I've purchased through iTunes over the last 20-some years, and I'm only allowed to authorize up to 5 devices to play music that I bought. Give me a freaking break. In some cases, I purchased that music with an old Apple ID that is attached to an email I no longer have access to because I changed ISPs 30 times, and so it's not recoverable. So essentially, I guess I've lost my rights to it, even though I purchased the stupid stuff. So believe me, it's better to pick up a used CD on Amazon for a couple of bucks and go to a used music store and actually buy the thing yourself in person and actually own the music outright, DRM free. And CDs have data in an archival state for the most part. I mean, for all intents and purposes, CDs are archival. Not CD-ROMs, but CDs. So yeah, before you ask, yes, I own a USB CD-ROM drive. I find it's still a pretty handy device to own, even though laptops no longer come with them built in. But I'm telling you, all you cool kids out there who like retro technology, and I know you're out there scrounging eBay for vintage Sony Walkman, you should consider the inevitable return of CDs now while they're uncool and prices are low. Or better yet, don't, so I can still get that cheap music. Anyway, screw Apple and their poorly implemented DRM. I'm just fed up with it. Rant over. So let's talk a little more about KMFDM. So apart from just having a ton of music out there, what really drew me to that band? So let's step into the Wayback Machine. This time we're going to dial it back to 1992. I was in college, if you can imagine that. I was a confirmed industrial music fan by this point, getting into some post-punk music and some other kinds of music, listening to a ton of music all the time. I was heavily into Nine Inch Nails, Ministry, Skinny Puppy, Nights Arab, branching into things like New Order and Joy Division, bunch of other things too, just collecting tons of music. I was finally on the internet, albeit just Usenet, still no web at this point in time, or at least not a web that I was on, but it was enough internet for me to be able to talk to other music fans and to learn from them. And another important information channel soon appeared in my life, and believe it or not, it was MTV. I had discovered 120 minutes, so every Saturday night, Dave Kendall would take 2 hours to highlight independent and alternative music. And, now, in my opinion, a lot of what they showed was still crap, okay? Like stuff that I wasn't interested in at all. And fortunately, I didn't bother really staying up to watch. I, like everyone else, had a VCR, and I programmed that thing to record the show every week. And kids, I'd say a VCR was like a TiVo as a way of explaining it to you, but I'm sure you don't even know or care what a TiVo was at this point. In short, it just let you record a TV channel. And VCRs obviously use magnetic tape and stone tablets. There was a tiny dinosaur inside the VCR that was actually chiseling all of that information onto stone tablets. And when you opened up the VCR, he'd look at you and shrug and say, "It's a living." TiVos were pretty much the same thing, but they used hard drives. So anyway, no one except your grandparents probably have a TiVo anymore. Back to it. Mondays after classes, I'd rewind my my tape, and I would watch pretty much the whole thing on fast forward because I'm just really lazy. And I would only stop for any good interviews or videos, you know, like Johnny Rotten in Tijuana, that kind of stuff. But I was always keeping an eye out for industrial bands I like, because unlike some of the other bands, they didn't get a lot of airplay, even on 120 minutes. Seemed like Dave Kendall was more interested in Concrete Blonde and Danielle Dax, and anyway, where are they now? You know, who knows? Anyway, I'm going to guess around January 1992, I saw, which was what was obviously an industrial video flickering by and fast forward, so I backed up and played it, and you could tell it was obviously an industrial video, because at the time they all kind of used the same cheesy inverted video effects, and you know, they all had like those fast cuts of all sorts of crazy stuff, and it was a very typical kind of video that industrial bands used. And I think a lot of these videos were produced by the folks at H-Gun Labs in Chicago. They did a lot of the videos for Wax Trax bands. And if you watch the Ministry live video, in case you didn't feel like showing up, and like Let Into Gold's Faster Than Light, they're all using the same kind of effects because they were into that thing. They must have had one bit of software or something that just made that kind of effect easy to do. And I gotta say that the H-Gun guys once made a band called Crunch-O-Matic, and I think the story was that they like pirated some of Trent Reznor's music software, and they put together a couple tunes and released them, and you know, I don't think the music really went anywhere, but they did do a pretty cool video for one of their songs, which was called Slaughterhouse, and that was on MTV for a hot minute back in 1990. Check it out. It's actually a really cool song, and a more stereotypical industrial video you'll never see. And it shows the band like playing a bunch of oil tanks, and it's so industrial. But yeah, I mean, they sank without a trace. I think it was mostly a joke band anyway. But I admit, the video is typical, but it's pretty cool if for that reason only, that it's just so typical. Anyway, I saw this KMFDM video on Fast Forward. I noticed it primarily featured two dudes. One was in sunglasses, and he was kind of hanging out on a boat, probably out on Lake Michigan. The other was this tall, scary, bald guy who had no eyebrows, and he was like walking around in slow motion. This is from memory. I haven't seen the video in a while. He might have been wearing a dress, like walking down the street. It was something that he tended to do. But the music is what really got me. It was this really noisy, complex electronic rhythm, but catchy and definitely like dancey, like a club tune, a harder club tune. By now you figured out, you know, the band was KMFDM, and the song was Vogue, which was the lead single off of their album Money. And I became an instant fan. I ran out probably that day and bought you know, the single and the album immediately. And from then on, I'd pretty much buy anything they released back to the start of their career, which was, I think, in '84 or so, until 2001 or so, when they broke up and attempted to reform. More on that later. But I was now living in the big city for college, so I had access to better record stores than the little town where I grew up. I was fortunate enough to be in one of those aforementioned awesome record stores one day to snap up their previous album that they released before Money, which was Naive. And this record would soon go out of print over a copyright dispute over samples that were used in one particular song, which was Libeslide, track 7, which sampled Carmina Burana by Carl Orff. And the band still uses those samples live, thank goodness, because it really is intrinsic to that song, as I think every KMFDM fan would agree. But this particular version of Naive, which some would argue is their best album, I don't know if I'd argue that, but we'll talk more about that later. But this went out of print, and I was fortunate to snap that up when I did. More on that later. So what what did I know about KMFDM at this point? Well, like I said, I had the internet on my side in 1992, so I could find out pretty much all I needed to know about any band at this point. There was somebody who knew more than I did, which isn't saying a heck of a lot. So at the time of this record, they were essentially down to 3 guys. They were all from Germany. Their leader was, and still is, this guy named Sasha Konietzko. He was the guy with the sunglasses in the boat. He usually has a pretty good mohawk going, and he wrote and sang on most of the songs on this album. And from what I could tell, he seemed to have like the final say on things that were going on in the band. He seemed to be in charge. The big bald guy was indeed a tall, scary-looking dude who did in fact like to cross-dress. Nothing wrong with that. His name was Nicholas Schandelmeyer, or N.Esh for short. And I don't know for sure, but I think it was meant to be a play on his initials, N.S. I don't know. But he still goes by N.Esh to this day. He wrote and sang on some of the tunes too for KMFDM, but not so much on Money, which we'll get to. I know that in general he played drums as well. He was actually a really good guitarist, still is. When I saw them first in 1997, I remember noticing that N.Esh was playing this yellow guitar that had these big black letters on it that said, "I eat big." And I never found out exactly what he ate there, what he was trying to say, but I did kind of regret not buying that guitar later when he sold it on eBay, because I had a connection to it. I was at a show where he used it, and I just thought it was funny. Anyway, he left the band in 1999. The third guy who was involved with Money was their guitarist, who went by the name, at the time, Svetlana Ambrosius, or Svet-Am for short, and pretty soon he would ditch that pseudonym and just go by his real name, which is Gunter Schultz. He was, and is, very simply, just a hot shit guitarist. Really good guitarist. Technical guitarist, has no trouble, playing complicated stuff and shredding and speed metal and all of that. Really impressive guitarist, but he also left the band in 1999. So the innovation behind KMFDM as a band is that, in my opinion here, this is just my opinion, is that they really did a great job pioneering the use of speed metal riffs with industrial disco, okay? Like a dance beat, but riffing heavy metal riffs over that. A lot of bands ended up doing this over the years. White Zombie would take this to new levels, and you could argue in the 1990s, but KMFDM did it first. And you can also argue that KMFDM did it better than anyone else. And they didn't identify as industrial, though, although they clearly were, or were in that camp, right? And like any good creative band, they didn't let other people label them. They made their own label, and their label was the ultra heavy beat. That's how they described their sound. So on the continuum between disco and heavy metal, they maybe sat a bit to the left of Ministry. Certainly Ministry would move far to the right on that continuum over the years, but we're still back here around 1992. Ministry was still involved in some electronics around that point, albeit less and less over the years. But KMFDM was, firmly in that industrial rock camp, not too terribly far from Ministry at the time. And KMFDM never really gave up electronics. They always kind of had that element of dance music to what they do. So what's up with their name? Their name, if I'm remembering correctly, and I'm not going to pronounce this correctly, but their name in German was Kein Mitleid für die Mehrheit, okay, which literally translated to no majority for the pity, which was Sasha's kind of Zen Dadaist corruption of no pity for the majority. So they came up with that name in an early show that they were doing, I guess, for an art installation. And in that show, Sasha more or less ended up playing a bunch of vacuum cleaners. According to legend, that's what happened. Anyway, one guy from the band at the time was English, and he had trouble saying or remembering that crazy long German name. and he suggested just shortening it to KMFDM, and there you have it. So over the years, of course, fans have come up with hundreds of alternative meanings for what it might stand for. You could readily find those online. So how did these guys rise to fame? You know, they were in Germany, kind of doing their own thing. They released a few albums. First, they released an album on their own label and kind of got released on a few other labels, and eventually they caught the attention of the Wax Trax gang in Chicago. So that was, if you recall, you know, where Al Jourgensen was doing a lot of ministry things, and it was kind of the center of the industrial scene in the United States for a time. And Wax Trax was the label in Chicago that was putting out a lot of that music. So Sasha got a phone call one day, hey, do you want to open for Ministry in the United States? And he was like, hell yeah, who's Ministry? And of course that was the notorious Mine Tour in 1990, the one with the chain link fence, or the first one with the chain link fence. Legend has it that Sasha studied Ministry's earlier recordings and was convinced, and maybe one would think a little dismayed, that they were paired up with such a wimpy synth pop band. So, you know, he and N.Ash dialed back all their instrumentation because at that time they were sounding a lot more aggressive. And they showed up in Chicago and caught Ministry live. There's like 2 drummers on the stage and 7 guys on guitar and 3 singers, and they were like, oh hell, we were egregiously misinformed, abort, go back to plan A. So yeah, they were at the time touring off of their album UAIOE, which came out before Naive, and they were playing music that would end up on singles like Godlike and the Split single, and also Naive that we were looking at before. So it was a pretty aggressive set list. I mean, this is really where they were coming into their own, playing that sort of ultra heavy beat music with a lot of riffing, thanks to Gunter Schultz. So playing on that tour got them a lot of notoriety, pretty much broke the band in the United States, and they started getting a lot of press, and you know, immediately fell in with Wax Trax. In fact, KMFDM stayed with Wax Trax to the bitter end when they ended up selling the label. I think it wasn't terribly long after Money came out that happened. So let's talk specifically about Money. And again, I'm not going to say that this is the best album by KMFDM, but it's where I got on the bus, and so it's important to me. It's the one that I remember farthest back because it was the first one I listened to. So anyway, one thing you got to know about KMFDM albums is that they all have the same overall look, and with very few exceptions, they were all designed by Brute, who's this fella who's aka Aidan Hughes. He's an English artist, and he does these pictures that all kind of look like woodcuts, but they're not woodcuts. But the net effect is that if you have a lot of KMFDM releases, they all kind of look like they came from the same box set. They all have the band name at the top and one of Brute's pictures in the middle and the title at the bottom, without a few exceptions where that's not the case. They also tend to use 5-letter album titles, and the band never really explained why that is. Maybe it's something that just sort of happened over time, but you know, my opinion is it obviously matches well, you know, graphically against the 5-letter band name, but it seems to work. And sometimes they've stretched this idea beyond what makes sense. They had an album in 1997 that was called Symbols, but really the real title was just 5 random symbols down here at the bottom. They also did an album in the 2000s that was called WTF, question mark, exclamation point, 5 characters, so that works. One thing that's apparent when you start listening to them is that they have a sense of humor, which is good to see. They don't take themselves too terribly seriously. Anyway, Money, as you see here, is predominantly purple, which is a plus in my book. I mean, most of the albums that they've released over the years were red, you know, and the first album was red, and then the last album in the first run was red, and you know, UAIOE is red, and I just got sick of seeing red after a while. It seems like maybe that's Sasha's favorite color. I have no idea. But yeah, purple's good. I think Money's the only purple one they ever did, as far as I know. I'm not really sure about that, but if so, it has that going for it. And Brute's art tends to focus on, chicks and guns or dudes getting punched in the face or stuff like that, so this one is just more of the same. So let's go track by track. This is not a very long album, but we'll hit these tracks here. You drop the needle, proverbially, on this CD, and the first thing you hear is a voice saying, "Hello, Teenage America." And I'm not sure why. I think that maybe has something to do with Meat Beat Manifesto, who was also, I think, in Chicago at the time, and I think they might have had a song called "Hello, Teenage America." I don't know. Did they have a song with that name? I don't know. Somebody tell me. Anyway, Money is this kind of mid-tempo, sort of like grinding song with Sasha more or less rapping about selling drugs to kids. I mean, hey, it was the early 90s, that's what happened. And the video to this song is something you have to check out because it features N.Esh as a cop, which you just gotta see. Vogue comes next, and of course that's the first song of theirs I ever heard on MTV. Fortunately, it has nothing at all to do with the Madonna track of the same name. I already kind of described this tune. It's pretty freaking noisy, but also very dancey. You got to check out the 12-inch version, which strips it way back, and I don't even think it has verse vocals on the 12-inch version. It's just like, an 8-minute slab of insanity. Really cool. Anyway, the next track is Help Us, Save Us, Take Us Away. This was an unexpected surprise, honestly, after the first two tracks. It's this down-tempo, really groovy tune with lots of atmospherics, and sounds like slide guitar with a little bit of echo, and just these great vocals by Dorona Alberti, who was singing with them at the time. Really cool track. Bargeld is next. This is, almost every KMFDM album has an obligatory track with German vocals on it, and this is the one for Money. And Bargeld, I guess, is slang for money, kind of like cash is in English. Blixa Bargeld from Einstürzen Neubauten, that kind of Bargeld. I really dig the guitar riff on this track, and I just don't really like the album version that much. They bring out that guitar riff much better in some of the remixes, and there's like 100 remixes of this song, which we'll see in a little bit here. But cool track. Spiritual House is interesting because it's in 5/4, and because Sasha is saying something funny in there about bunny rabbits. I don't really know what the lyrics are, but I do hear him say bunny rabbit at one point, so hey, what do you know? Sex on the Flag is the next track. It's a straight up pop tune. It's just like a 4 on the floor, catchy banger, like made to be played in a club really loud, and it has, very verse, chorus, verse kind of structure, has lots of hooks, has a really funky bass line, and it has this really nice guitar solo in it from Gunther. The thing I really love about this track, though, has nothing to do with the music at all, but it has to do with the name. It is I don't know if you can read that, but that says it's the Jezza Bielza Butt Funk mix. So, and that's a mixed name that they've used on a few of their tracks over the years. Maybe it's like an honorific. It's like calling a track Sir. I have such respect for this track that I'm going to call it the Jezza Bielza Butt Funk mix. But just reading that as a kid on the cassette tape that I bought of this album, I just knew I was going to love this band. That's all I needed to know, right? Okay, so track 7 is I Will Pray. This is just a remix of their greatest song ever, which, of course, any KMFDM fan knows is Godlike. That's their best song ever. Fight Me, that's what it is. Why they remixed Godlike and gave it a different name is something I'll get into here, but this mix is, it's pretty dubbed out. I like it. It's rad. And it's the first version of Godlike I ever heard. Then there's We Must Awaken, which is like this pretty cool tune that's assembled from various Jimi Hendrix bits and pieces, and I think the main one is from Voodoo Child Slight Return, which I didn't know as a kid because I was uncultured. What can I say? I'm ashamed of that, but I admit it now. And I did recognize it later, to my credit. you know, when some stoners were playing Hendrix in college, and I was like, whoa, he's playing KMFDM, man, which they didn't understand at all. So this CD has some bonus tracks here that weren't available on my cassette that I had originally. The first one is something called Under Satan, which contains a bit of Die Now, Live Later from the Naive album. It sounds like something Sasha threw together in a half an hour, which we'll talk about. He probably did. Then there's a remix of Vogue 2000. That's pretty good, I guess. And the Deutschmark remix of Money, which is another remix of Money. So I should mention that at this time in their career, KMFDM put about half their effort into albums, but the other half went into their singles. And for many, many years, like in the late 80s and early 90s, they were putting out a few singles every year, almost always with new and cool stuff on them. So the band did a lot of the remixing themselves. It wasn't like these like remix factories that were overused in the early 90s where, you know, you send your track to Shep Pettibone and he takes the very top line vocal and just puts a bunch of freaking drum machines on it and runs them for 12 minutes and calls it an extended mega mix or something. It wasn't like that at all. So the band was having a lot of control over their own remixes. They were either doing it themselves or picking who did it. And they were great at putting a different spin on these tracks, like bringing out different aspects of the song or just deconstructing it into something else completely. And that's one of the things that attracted me to this band, that they were so flexible and creative. So like a song on an album here, it was just a starting point for them. And you always knew that they were going to be coming back to take those tracks and jump off into a bunch of crazy directions with it. And that's part of what I look forward to when they would come out with new music. And of course then you had no idea how they were going to present the track live. Were they going to do the album version or a single version, or were they going to come up with something completely different, you know? So usually it was somewhere in between, but it kept me interested. So the singles for Money were Vogue, which came out, if I'm not mistaken, just before the album. And there was a single for the song Money itself, which is confusing. And finally, there was a single for Help Us, Save Us, Take Us Away. And let's just talk about these real quick in turn. So my favorite of these is the Vogue single. It's pretty rad. It contains, you know, one of my favorite mixes ever of their earlier song, Split, which was also a single. But, you know, they were just revisiting these old tracks on some of these singles. So yeah, this Split Apart is the version of Split that would have appeared on Apart, which we'll talk about in a minute. The other two singles never really interested me that much. I think just because there's like so many remixes of Money and Bargeld on here, and I like got tired of listening to them. I don't think I ever had the patience to listen to these the whole way through. If I recall, like some of the mixes are pretty good, and there is a mix of on here of Bargeld that definitely brought out that riff that I liked, which is cool. And of course, here's the Jezebelza Butt Funk mix of Bargeld, so be sure to check that out, guys. And you know, they're a little bit funny. There's the Wiener mix and the Schnitzel mix and the Jaeger mix and the Meister mix. So again, they have a sense of humor. They're not taking themselves that seriously. So let's go back to the album, Money proper. How did this come about? Well, you know, how does any album come about? You know, the bands produce albums and they tour. That's kind of the business of being a band. But there's a little more to it with this album. So the story goes that following the huge Ministry Mind tour in 1990, Sasha and NS weren't really getting along. So they ended up releasing Naive, but then they weren't sure if they wanted to like keep the band going. So 1991 came, and they weren't sure if they wanted to pursue KMFDM anymore, but instead of just like knocking it on the head, they decided to make a farewell album, and that album was going to be called Apart. So the idea was that Sasha would write side A, and NS would write side B, so they each went off to write their parts of the album. It turns out Wax Trax were happy with Sasha's songs, but less so with NS's. And they said it just didn't sound like KMFDM, and they couldn't release it because the fans would, storm the studio. They would feel ripped off. And the story goes that those songs wound up on NS's solo album, Cheesy, which I also have but forgot to grab for this video. But anyway, those tracks on Cheesy, to me, sound more or less like KMFDM. In fact, in subsequent years, KMFDM would play some of them live. There's a bit on this live video that you can check out. This is a DVD, kids, called Beat by Beat by Beat. And it includes a lot of video clips of them playing live around the time we're talking about here. So these are like the Money Tour you see in 1992, bootleg videos, live in Dallas bootleg videos. There's a lot of crazy stuff on here, and band behind the scenes stuff and so on. But there's also a brief clip on this, one of these, I think it's on the documentary part of this DVD, where they're playing Rule the Mob, which is one of NS's songs that was on Cheesy. And they played that on the Angst Tour, which is another great album I will talk about in the future. Angst came out after Money. Anyway, Wax Trax didn't like NS as part of the album, so plan B to save it was for Sasha to hastily write a couple more tracks and remixes and just kind of like throw all that stuff onto side B, and that's, I think, where a lot of these remixes and tracks came from. So a part became Money. The album ended up being fairly successful, and following the big Ministry tour and this successful break in America, the band ended up not breaking up after all, yet, at least at that point in their career. We'll talk a bit more about that momentarily. But I dig this album because I got pretty into KMFDM for a while, especially I remember 20 years ago or 25 years ago. That was a really big deal to me. I followed them more or less until their big breakup in 1999 and maybe an album or two after that. But then I think I just tuned out. I got distracted with life and kind of, I wouldn't say lost interest in them, but I like a lot of bands that I love, I just didn't have the energy to keep up with music as much as I used to. So there's a long period of time around there where I just wasn't tuned into them at all. But to me, they always represented the accessible side of industrial music. Okay, so this is essentially like pop music. They tend to write music that's very verse, chorus, verse. They throw tons of hooks into there. Okay, it's abrasive a little bit. It has an edge to it, and some of the music's pretty darn hard, but it's accessible, and it's sort of pop music that's dressed up with electronics and beats and distorted vocals. They're not saying that it's not pop music. And all of this would become cliches for other bands to copy in following years. Like I said, White Zombie, and take your pick. It was part of that industrial rock formula. And once Nine Inch Nails went big, everybody wanted to be the next Nine Inch Nails, right? But to some extent, Nine Inch Nails was derived from the kind of styles KMFDM was doing earlier in their career too. For sure. And KMFDM was around longer than Nine Inch Nails, so I'm sure they had some influence there. KMFDM's kind of hard to copy, though. They had their own unique sense of humor. One of the things you'll notice pretty quickly is that they frequently reference themselves in lyrics, usually in a tongue-in-cheek or very self-deprecating way. In fact, later they would write a song called Sucks that explained why they did indeed suck, and to this day, fans will chant KMFDM sucks at concerts, and that's like a point of pride for them. And despite their making album after album of what some would consider very similar sounding music, I think they managed to embrace a pretty wide variety of styles and guest performers over the years. So there's always a twist on what they're doing. And if I'm not mistaken, I'm pretty sure that by now Sasha's written songs in over a dozen languages and released them, and often writing and singing them himself. This is a guy who's dedicated to giving other voices some airtime, and I can respect that. He's interested in different cultures, different perspectives, different people. And KMFDM's always had a bit of that political perspective. You know, they're interested in standing up for those who don't have a voice and kind of questioning authority, and they're really coming from that sort of punk DIY place, even if they don't really sound very punk. And, you know, the detractors on the internet, the trolls, you know, they like to complain about how every album sounds exactly the same, but I say there's a reason why bands like KMFDM and AC/DC exist, because, you know, people like what they like, and some like as much of it as they can get. Frank Zappa said something to that effect once. You know, if you haven't already, check out some of Frank Zappa's interviews, you know, on YouTube. You'll learn something, I guarantee it. He was very aware that not everyone loved his music, but he also knew that some people did. And for those people, he was intent on giving them as much of it as he possibly could, and to hell with everybody else. So he was writing for his fans, and that's what KMFDM had been doing, you know. And to no surprise, Sasha turns out as a big Frank Zappa fan. In fact, and he said as much in many interviews, there's ample evidence of that. And in fact, some of their songs on UAIOE sort of, you know, let's say borrow lyrics pretty liberally from Zappa tunes. So I think here's UAIOE, and if you look at the lyrics to that song and maybe compare them to Zappa's I'm the Slime, like form your own conclusions there. But yeah, Sasha, Frank Zappa fan for sure, big Frank Zappa fan. Anyway, you know, KMFDM, they're nothing if not consistent, though, after, 40 years now? It's been a long time, so very consistent. Let's talk just a minute about where these guys are now. So, if you think about it, oh boy, Money was, I guess about 30 years ago, 31 years ago. Holy heck, I am old. That's really depressing. 31 years ago. But the band's still rolling along, and in fact, I'm pretty sure they just released their 22nd studio album, and Sasha's still, you know, at the helm of that band. And like I said, I haven't listened to much of their newer stuff. I dropped off around, I want to say about 2001. They had broken up. What had happened was that Enesh and Gunther Schultz decided to split. So, you know, once again, they decided rather than just splitting immediately, they would do another farewell album, and this time it was called Adios. And if I remember, Sasha then made a statement shortly thereafter that the band was done. And that was that, or so we thought. And a few months later, he announced a new band was coming out, and it would be called, get this, MDFMK. I mean, that's legit, right? That's legit. I mean, you know, it's MDFMK. It's absolutely not KMFDM. It's a completely different band, people. Come on. So there was one MDFMK album, and then, whoa, guess what? He decided, you know, I'd rather restart KMFDM, this time with a bunch of his previous collaborators, and, you know, fortunately for him, he had a big bench to pull from because he had guest musicians on every album, and people who would play for a while and leave and come back and leave again and so on over the years. So it seemed to me that after they reformed in 2000 or 2001 or whenever that was, they became more of what seemed to me to be like a rock band with like semi-permanent guitarists and a semi-permanent drummer. And I don't know, I guess I missed that weirdness that Enesh had brought to things, or I don't know, maybe I just couldn't be bothered to keep up with them anymore. Like I said, life intervenes and we end up getting distracted for any number of reasons and, you know, losing track of things we once spent a lot of time on. But I think Enesh and Gunther started their own project called Slick Idiot that naturally, to me, sounded exactly like KMFDM, and that sort of ran on in parallel for a few years, but, you know, predictably ended up fizzling out. And as far as I know, Enesh is still singing here and there, and I heard that Gunter teaches guitar now. He's just like teaching people to play guitar, which I think is really cool. I would definitely take lessons from him. But I guess KMFDM got quite a bit bigger in the few years after Money was released. They released, like I said, an album called Angst that was a bit more guitar heavy. I think there was a period of time in the early to mid 90s where every band was somewhat influenced by the rise of grunge. And maybe I could talk about this more in its own episode sometime, but definitely there was there was a tendency among all music at the time to go heavy and hard there with the guitars in the early 90s. And that's what Angst was for KMFDM. But after that, they had an album called Nihil, which is definitely their most commercially successful record. Not my favorite record personally, but they had a song on there called Juke Joint Jezebel that would chart, and I think it was on the soundtrack to Mortal Kombat, which, as we know, won all the Emmys that year. The Emmys? Oscars? One of those. It won them all. Maybe it won all of them. Not my favorite song or album, but, you know, people dug it. There's no accounting for taste. Whatever. I would first see them live on the Symbols Tour in 1997, and for me, that was a cool tour because Ogre was with them, and he got to get up there and act all weird on stage without any makeup. And I just remember he was wearing this great shirt, and it looked like it said Polaroid. If you looked at it, it looked like the word mark for Polaroid. But if you looked more carefully, you saw that it said Paranoid, which was hilarious. Also, it impressed me that Ogre knew all the German lyrics to Liebeslide, so props to Ogre for learning the German lyrics. I went to that show with a buddy of mine, but I remember we ran into a bunch of more folks that we knew at that show, friends and, you know, acquaintances, and one of them, who was a little younger than us, if I remember correctly, had become a music journalist around that time, and he came out all excited claiming he had just interviewed the band, you know, got to hang out with them before the show, and that was great. But my buddy and I waited after the show outside the bus for like a long time, and it was really cold. I remember just like outside this warehouse in the big city, right? And no one came out. I remember Tim Skold did like trudge onto the bus without a word, like wearing this ridiculous fur coat or something. And that's when I realized that he's only like, you know, 5 feet tall. But I don't know, maybe something happened at that show that just pissed everybody off. I have no idea. Word is, by all accounts, that KMFDM is very fan-friendly and they love meet and greets, so I have no idea. I have no idea what happened that night. And I certainly don't hold it against them. I would not have come out of my bus to talk to me either, so right on. Anyway, we had like packed up and drove home, and that was that. But I continued collecting them for a few years, and even though I stopped really being a super fan of theirs, I still love their earlier music, and I love this album, Money, and I do still check in with them from time to time, and every now and then, you know, I'll you know, pick up one of their later albums, and I'll just listen to it, you know, in the car while I'm working. Boy, you know, just so rarely put an album on anymore and just give it that all of my attention, you know, that deep listen. And I wonder if anybody does anymore, really. I mean, do people do that anymore? Maybe people who have vinyl do that, and maybe that's the attraction that people have to vinyl. It kind of forces you to be in one place wherever your record player is and listen to the damn thing, right? Is that what it is? I don't know, somebody explain that to me. But yeah, I still catch some of their music when I can, and I've bought, you know, some of their later albums for sure. And I can't preach chapter and verse on that stuff, but every now and then one of their songs will really dig into my head, you know, 1 or 2 tracks from an album, and yeah, I'm thinking they still have it. That's amazing after all those years. So there you go, KMFDM Money. Hope you enjoyed that. That's really all I've got for you here today. If you like this discussion, cool, stay tuned. I have plenty of other old-ass 80s and 90s industrial and alternative music to talk about. So if you dig it, as the kids say, please like and subscribe. And until next time, folks, stay strong.